Lorenzo De Luca had never chased a woman. He didn't have to. Women crossed crowded rooms to reach him, found excuses to stand beside him, and sometimes embarrassed themselves just for the chance to make Chicago's coldest mafia boss look at them twice. But right now, on a private beach outside Chicago, Lorenzo was staring at a beautiful plus-size woman in a burgundy dress, walking away from him, not toward him, not looking over her shoulder, away. And judging by the three stunned women sitting behind Lorenzo, Amelia Carter had just done something none of them could quite believe. One of Lorenzo's bodyguards took a step forward. "Boss?" Lorenzo lifted one hand. The guard stopped immediately. "No." His voice was calm, almost too calm. His dark eyes remained fixed on Amelia as she continued along the shoreline, her long dark hair moving in the breeze, and absolutely no indication that she intended to turn around. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. Interesting. Only minutes earlier, the private beach had looked very different. Lorenzo had arrived with 2 bodyguards and immediately changed the atmosphere without saying a word. Conversations had softened. A resort employee had hurried forward to greet him. 2 men near the bar had suddenly found somewhere else to stand, and 3 women lounging several feet away had noticed him almost immediately. Amelia had noticed him too. That wasn't the problem. She knew exactly who Lorenzo De Luca was. Most people in Chicago did. 38 years old, wealthy enough that nobody could agree on how much he was actually worth, handsome enough to make strangers stare, and powerful enough that intelligent people knew better than to ask where all that power came from. The legitimate newspapers called him a businessman. Chicago called him something else. Mafia. Lorenzo hadn't approached the women. He hadn't needed to. Within minutes, one had found a reason to introduce herself. Another had laughed slightly too loudly at something Lorenzo barely said. The third had moved closer under the excuse of asking whether a chair beside him was occupied. And Amelia had watched the entire thing happen from several feet away, not with jealousy, not with insecurity, with something closer to exhaustion. Because there were few things Amelia Carter disliked more than watching grown women quietly turn themselves into contestants the moment an attractive man entered a room. One of her friends had nudged her. Another had whispered that Lorenzo had looked in their direction. Amelia hadn't cared. Then someone suggested she should go over too. That was when Amelia had stood. Not angrily, not dramatically. She simply decided she would rather enjoy the shoreline than spend another minute watching women compete for a man who appeared perfectly comfortable being competed over. And she walked away. What Amelia didn't know was that Lorenzo had noticed her before she stood. The burgundy dress had caught his attention first, then her face, then something far more unusual, her complete lack of interest in being noticed by him. When Lorenzo had arrived, every other woman in that little section of beach had changed somehow. Posture, voice, expression, attention. Amelia hadn't. She had remained exactly the same, and when the women began moving toward him, she had moved in the opposite direction. Now Lorenzo watched the distance between them grow. 10 feet, 20, 30. One of the women beside him tried to reclaim his attention. "Lorenzo?" He didn't look at her. That alone silenced her. His bodyguards exchanged a brief glance. They knew their boss well enough not to comment. They had seen women wait outside private restaurants because they knew Lorenzo was inside. They had watched daughters of powerful men arrange accidental meetings that weren't accidental at all. They had watched beautiful women compete for invitations to his parties, his cars, his table, sometimes his bed. Lorenzo usually treated all of it with the same cold indifference. Attention was cheap. He had received too much of it, for too long, to mistake it for anything meaningful. But this was different. Because Amelia Carter hadn't rejected him. Rejection would have required Lorenzo to offer something first. She had done something considerably stranger. She had removed herself before he could. Lorenzo finally turned toward one of his guards. Who is she? The question came quietly. The guard hesitated. That hesitation was enough to make Lorenzo's eyes sharpen. I don't know yet. Lorenzo looked back toward the shoreline. Amelia was farther away now, still walking, still not looking back. Find out. The guard nodded once. No questions, no smile. No surprise. But as he stepped away, Lorenzo knew exactly what his men would be thinking. Their boss had just asked for the name of a woman, Lorenzo De Luca, who routinely forgot the names of women, who spent entire evenings trying to impress him. Behind him, one of Amelia's friends shifted uncomfortably. Another stared after Amelia with an expression that was becoming less surprised and considerably more complicated, because they had noticed something Amelia hadn't. Lorenzo's attention had followed her, completely. The champagne beside him remained untouched. The women surrounding him might as well have disappeared. And for the first time that afternoon, the coldest man on that beach looked genuinely interested in something, or someone. Several yards away, Amelia finally slowed. For one dangerous second, Lorenzo thought she might turn around. She didn't. She simply paused, near the edge of the water, looked out across it for several seconds, then continued walking. Something almost resembling amusement touched Lorenzo's face, not quite a smile. Lorenzo De Luca didn't smile easily, but something about Amelia Carter had just disturbed a pattern that had existed for most of his adult life. Women came toward him, always. Sometimes because of his face, usually because of his money, often because of his name, and occasionally because they believed getting close to Lorenzo De Luca meant getting close to the kind of power ordinary people never touched. Amelia had known the name. She had seen the money around him. She had seen the guards. She had seen 3 women already fighting for scraps of his attention, and her response had been to leave. Lorenzo should have forgotten her before she reached the end of the beach. Instead, he was already wondering where she would be that evening, what she sounded like when she wasn't speaking to her friends, whether she was always this indifferent to powerful men, or whether there was something about him she specifically disliked. That last possibility should have irritated him. Instead, it made him curious, and curiosity was dangerous in a man like Lorenzo De Luca, because Lorenzo didn't wonder about things for long. He investigated them, he uncovered them, and when something truly captured his attention, he had a habit of refusing to let it remain beyond his reach. His bodyguard returned several minutes later. Amelia Carter, he said quietly. 31. She's staying here with the 3 women behind you. Lorenzo's gaze shifted slightly. Carter. Yes. How long? Until Sunday. 4 more days. Lorenzo looked toward the distant figure in burgundy. 4 days should have been meaningless. He was at the resort because of business. Important business. The kind involving men who lied carefully, money that had disappeared. And one person inside the De Luca organization Lorenzo had begun to suspect was betraying him. He had no time for distractions, especially beautiful ones, especially stubborn ones, especially ones who walked away. Lorenzo reached for his untouched glass. Forget it! His guard knew better than to answer, because Lorenzo's eyes were still on Amelia, and somewhere behind him, 3 women who had spent the afternoon trying desperately to become interesting to Lorenzo De Luca were beginning to understand something humiliating. The woman who had tried the least was the only one he was watching. Amelia disappeared beyond the curve of the private shoreline. Only then did Lorenzo finally look away. He told himself that was the end of it. A strange woman, a strange reaction, nothing more. But several hours later, when Amelia Carter walked into the resort's private dining room, she stopped. Because Lorenzo De Luca was already there, and of all the places prepared around the long, elegant table, there was only one empty chair remaining, the chair directly beside him. Lorenzo slowly lifted his eyes to hers. Amelia looked at the chair, then at him, and for the first time all day, She couldn't simply walk away. If Lorenzo and Emilia's story has you hooked already, subscribe to Mafia Muse Affairs for more powerful mafia romance stories. And don't forget to like this video and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Emilia Carter remained at the entrance of the private dining room for several seconds. The chair beside Lorenzo De Luca was still empty. Every other seat was occupied. Of course it was. The resort had transformed its private dining terrace for the evening, with a long table overlooking the water, soft lights glowing beneath the covered veranda, expensive crystal catching the last traces of daylight. Emilia had expected dinner, good food, a few hours with her friends. Maybe enough laughter to erase the uncomfortable scene from the beach. She had not expected Lorenzo De Luca to be sitting near the center of the table, looking directly at her. And she certainly hadn't expected the only available chair to be beside him. Vanessa noticed first. Emilia saw the change in her friend's expression almost immediately. The same Vanessa who had spent half the afternoon trying to hold Lorenzo's attention was now looking between Emilia, the empty chair, and Lorenzo. There were two other women from their group seated nearby. Bianca Hayes, confident and glamorous, who could turn ordering water into something flirtatious, and Claire Donovan, elegant, successful, and usually far too composed to care whether a man noticed her. Usually. Lorenzo De Luca had apparently changed the rules. Emilia quietly crossed the room. She wasn't going to create a spectacle over a chair. She pulled it out and sat. Lorenzo didn't greet her immediately. That surprised her. She had expected the kind of arrogance that came naturally to powerful men who were accustomed to controlling rooms. Instead, he continued listening to the resort director, speaking across the table. Emilia almost relaxed. Almost. Because although Lorenzo wasn't looking at her, she could feel his awareness. It was subtle, uncomfortable, and strangely deliberate. One of his bodyguards stood several yards behind him. The second was positioned near the terrace entrance. Neither looked particularly interested in dinner. They were watching doors, windows, staff, guests, everything. Emilia noticed. Lorenzo noticed her noticing. That was when he finally turned. "You know who I am." It wasn't really a question. Emilia looked at him. Up close, he was somehow more intimidating. Not because he was trying to be. That was the problem. There was no performance to Lorenzo De Luca. No unnecessary scowl. No exaggerated hardness. His authority seemed settled inside him. Quiet. Certain. Emilia answered simply, "Yes." Something shifted in his expression. Barely. "And you still walked away." Emilia understood immediately. So that was bothering him. Not that she had insulted him. Not that she had rejected him. The fact that she hadn't behaved as expected. Emilia glanced toward the other guests before returning her attention to him. "I wanted to walk." It wasn't entirely an answer. Lorenzo knew it. Emilia knew he knew it. But instead of pressing her, he returned his attention to dinner. That should have ended the conversation. It didn't, because something had now been established between them. A question, and Lorenzo De Luca did not look like a man who enjoyed unanswered questions. Dinner continued. Emilia gradually discovered that Lorenzo's presence affected almost everyone differently. Men became more careful. Women became more attentive. Staff became almost unnaturally precise. One businessman across the table laughed too enthusiastically whenever Lorenzo made even the smallest remark. Another kept mentioning people they apparently both knew, as though proving proximity to Lorenzo might increase his own importance. Emilia watched it quietly. Now she understood why Lorenzo's attention on the beach had irritated her. It wasn't really about him. It was about the performance surrounding him. People stopped behaving naturally. Everyone wanted something. Access, approval, attention. Emilia had spent too much of her life protecting her peace to volunteer for that kind of competition. The first course disappeared, then the second. Lorenzo barely touched his wine. Emilia noticed that too. He was always watching. Not obviously, but constantly. Then the conversation shifted toward Chicago development. That caught Amelia's attention. She worked as an interior architect, primarily designing commercial and hospitality spaces. She understood how a building could influence people before they consciously understood what they were feeling. A man named Richard Bellamy began discussing a luxury redevelopment project. Amelia listened. Then, Richard made an assertion about the project's public spaces that she knew would create problems. She disagreed. Calmly, professionally. Richard looked surprised. He asked what she did. Amelia told him. The faint amusement that appeared on his face told her everything before he spoke. He dismissed interior architecture as essentially decorating expensive rooms. Amelia had heard variations of it before. She was already preparing her response when Lorenzo placed his glass down. The sound was quiet. But somehow, the table became quieter. Lorenzo didn't insult Richard. He didn't threaten him. He simply explained that the DeLuca Group had lost millions years earlier correcting a hospitality development designed by executives who had treated interior architecture as decoration instead of infrastructure. Then he looked directly at Richard. If you don't understand the value of someone's profession, that doesn't reduce its value. Silence. Richard's smile disappeared. Amelia stared at Lorenzo. He hadn't rescued her. That distinction mattered. He hadn't spoken because Amelia couldn't. He had corrected something he considered inaccurate. Then Lorenzo returned to his meal. Conversation eventually restarted, but Amelia found herself studying him differently. Later, when dinner was ending, she stepped onto the terrace alone. The air had cooled. Behind her, laughter and conversation continued. Amelia rested her hands against the railing and looked toward the darkening water. She heard someone approach. She didn't need to turn around. Something about Lorenzo's presence announced itself before his voice did.
You didn't need me to say anything.
Amelia looked sideways.
No.
I know. There it was again. That strange precision. Amelia studied him. Most men who stepped into a situation like that wanted gratitude. Lorenzo seemed uninterested in receiving any. I was correcting him, Lorenzo continued. Not protecting you. Amelia's expression softened slightly. That distinction matters. I thought it might. For the first time, Amelia became genuinely curious about Lorenzo DeLuca, and that was considerably more dangerous than simply finding him attractive. Their conversation remained brief, but before Amelia returned inside, she asked him the question that had been forming throughout dinner. Did he actually enjoy it? The attention, the people constantly trying to impress him, the women competing, the men agreeing with him before he'd finished speaking. Lorenzo didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved through the glass doors toward the room behind them. Amelia watched something colder settle over his expression. Finally, he said, "No." One word, nothing more. Amelia walked back inside. Lorenzo remained on the terrace, and for several seconds, Chicago's coldest mafia boss stared at a room filled with people desperate for his attention, while thinking about the only woman who had asked whether he even wanted it. The following morning, Lorenzo woke before sunrise. That wasn't unusual. What happened next? Bovioes. By 7:30, he had already received an encrypted report from Chicago. One of his lieutenants had discovered another discrepancy. Money had vanished from a DeLuca-controlled import operation. Not enough to damage the organization. Enough to send a message. Someone was stealing. Worse, someone believed Lorenzo hadn't noticed. The resort wasn't merely a vacation destination for him. One of the men Lorenzo suspected was scheduled to arrive there within 48 hours for what he believed was an ordinary business meeting. Lorenzo intended to discover whether he was dealing with incompetence, greed, or betrayal. That should have occupied his complete attention. Instead, at precisely 9 minutes after 9, Lorenzo looked through the windows of the resort restaurant and saw Amelia Carter. He stopped walking. One bodyguard almost did the same. Amelia was having breakfast with Claire. She wore a simple, flowing outfit, her hair loosely gathered away from her face. No burgundy dress, no dramatic shoreline, no reason for Lorenzo to stare. He stared anyway. His guard noticed. Lorenzo continued walking. He chose a table across the restaurant, not beside Amelia, not even particularly close, but close enough. He opened the file his men had prepared. Shipping manifests. Names, dates, payments. Lorenzo read the same paragraph twice. Across the room, Amelia laughed. His eyes lifted. The sound wasn't flirtatious, wasn't carefully measured. She wasn't even aware he was there. That made it worse. Lorenzo returned to the file. A few minutes later, Amelia noticed him. Their eyes met. She gave him a small acknowledging nod. Nothing more. Then she returned to her conversation. Lorenzo stared at her for another second. His bodyguard suddenly found the opposite wall fascinating. Lorenzo's gaze hardened. "Don't." The guard said nothing. He didn't need to. Lorenzo knew exactly what he'd seen on the man's face. Amusement. By noon, it happened again. Amelia was near the resort pool when Lorenzo crossed the courtyard after a meeting. This time she was alone. Lorenzo could have continued walking. He didn't. He stopped. Amelia looked up. There was a brief pause between them. Neither seemed willing to acknowledge how often coincidence was beginning to occur. Lorenzo asked whether she was enjoying the resort. Amelia said she was. Then she asked whether he ever actually relaxed. The question caught him off guard. Lorenzo glanced toward the bodyguard several feet behind him. Amelia followed his gaze. She didn't need an answer. That almost made him smile. Their conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Nothing important, nothing romantic. Yet Lorenzo walked away, knowing Amelia preferred coffee without sugar, that she hated overcrowded restaurants, and that she had nearly declined the trip because she had been buried in work. He remembered all 3 details. That irritated him, because Lorenzo remembered information for strategic reasons: numbers, faces, weaknesses, promises, debts. He did not usually store how a woman drank her coffee. That afternoon, Amelia's friends noticed, Vanessa especially. The 4 women were sitting beneath a shaded terrace when Lorenzo passed on his way toward the private conference wing. His attention moved toward Amelia automatically, only briefly. But Vanessa saw it. Bianca saw it. Claire definitely saw it. Amelia pretended she hadn't. Vanessa made a teasing remark about Amelia apparently becoming Lorenzo De Luca's favorite person at the resort. Amelia dismissed it, but Vanessa continued. The tone remained playful, until it didn't. There was something underneath it. Something sharper. Amelia recognized it. Jealousy. And immediately, the entire situation became less enjoyable. She didn't want this. She didn't want women measuring themselves against her because a man happened to be interested. She certainly didn't want a friendship turning into competition. Amelia changed the subject, but Vanessa didn't forget. Neither did Lorenzo, because later that evening, he saw Vanessa approach him. She was beautiful, confident, perfectly dressed, and under any other circumstances, Lorenzo might have entertained the conversation for several minutes out of politeness. Tonight, his attention kept drifting elsewhere. Amelia was standing across the terrace talking with Claire. Vanessa noticed. Her smile tightened. She moved slightly closer to Lorenzo. Amelia looked over at precisely the wrong moment. She saw Vanessa beside him, saw the familiar posture, saw Lorenzo standing there, and something inside Amelia closed. Not because she was jealous, because this was exactly what she had refused to participate in from the beginning. Amelia excused herself from Claire. Then she left the terrace. Lorenzo saw her go. Again. His expression changed. Vanessa was still speaking when Lorenzo handed his untouched drink to a passing waiter. "Excuse me," 2 words. Then he walked away. Vanessa stared after him. Lorenzo reached the corridor, leading toward the resort lobby, but Amelia was already gone. For several seconds, he stood there. His bodyguard remained behind him, waiting. Lorenzo had spent years watching women create reasons to remain near him. Amelia Carter kept finding reasons to leave, and for the first time, Lorenzo was beginning to understand that watching her disappear bothered him considerably more than it should. But before he could decide whether to find her, his second bodyguard approached. The man's expression erased every trace of distraction from Lorenzo's face. "Boss, we have a problem." Lorenzo's eyes became cold. "How bad?" The guard lowered his voice. "The missing money wasn't moved out of Chicago." A pause. "It came here." Lorenzo went completely still. Somewhere inside the resort, the betrayal he'd come to investigate was already waiting for him. And suddenly, Amelia Carter was standing much closer to Lorenzo's dangerous world than either of them realized. By the next morning, Lorenzo had changed. Amelia noticed immediately. He wasn't at breakfast. He wasn't near the pool. He didn't appear on the terrace. His bodyguards were gone too. For the first time since she'd met him, Lorenzo De Luca seemed to have disappeared from the resort. Amelia told herself she didn't care. That was almost true. She spent the morning with Claire and Bianca. Vanessa joined them later, but the atmosphere between the women had shifted. Nothing openly hostile, nothing dramatic, just small silences where there hadn't been silences before. Vanessa finally asked whether Amelia and Lorenzo had something going on. Amelia answered honestly, no. They had spoken. That was all. Vanessa didn't seem convinced. She pointed out that Lorenzo watched Amelia whenever she entered a room. Amelia's patience thinned. She had not asked Lorenzo to watch her. She hadn't approached him. She hadn't encouraged him. And she wasn't going to apologize because a man Vanessa found attractive had become interested in someone else. Vanessa's expression hardened. Then came the accusation Amelia had been expecting without realizing it. Maybe walking away had been Amelia's strategy all along. Maybe she knew that ignoring a man like Lorenzo would make him curious. The words landed badly. Amelia stared at her friend. Then her voice became very calm. She explained that she hadn't walked away because she wanted Lorenzo to follow. She walked away because she didn't compete for men. Not yesterday, not today, not ever. If Vanessa wanted Lorenzo, she could pursue him. Amelia wouldn't stand in her way. Then Amelia left. Neither woman realized someone had heard the final part of the conversation. Lorenzo stood beyond the open terrace doors. He had returned from a 4-hour meeting, with information that should have occupied every thought in his head. One of his trusted captains, Marco Vescari, had been moving De Luca money through shell accounts connected to the resort, and Marco was arriving that evening. Lorenzo had spent the morning preparing to confront a traitor. Yet now, his attention followed Amelia. Again, Vanessa saw him. The color changed in her face. Lorenzo didn't embarrass her, didn't reprimand her. He simply asked which direction Amelia had gone. Vanessa didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Lorenzo had already seen the corridor door closing, and this time, he followed. Amelia had reached the quieter side of the property when she heard footsteps behind her. She kept walking. The footsteps continued. Then Lorenzo said her name. Amelia stopped. She turned. He was alone. No bodyguards, no admirers, no audience. Just Lorenzo. His expression was unreadable. Amelia's was not. She was irritated. Lorenzo told her he'd heard enough of the conversation to understand why she was leaving. Amelia wished he hadn't. The last thing she wanted was Lorenzo believing he needed to resolve a disagreement between her and Vanessa. He didn't. Instead, he did something Amelia hadn't expected. He made his position clear. There was no competition. There had never been a competition. He wasn't interested in Vanessa. He wasn't interested in Bianca. He wasn't interested in the women from the beach. The only woman at the resort he had deliberately sought out was Amelia. The statement left her silent, not because she hadn't suspected it, because Lorenzo De Luca didn't sound like a man who said things casually. Amelia looked at him carefully. She reminded him that only days earlier, he'd been sitting comfortably while women competed for his attention. Lorenzo didn't deny it. He simply admitted that their attention had never mattered enough for him to stop it. That answer wasn't flattering. It was brutally honest. For years, women had approached him. He had accepted the attention because accepting required nothing. No vulnerability, no uncertainty, no risk. Amelia was different, because Amelia made him mound. Across restaurants, through corridors, down beaches, toward her. And Lorenzo was beginning to understand just how unfamiliar that was. Amelia felt the attraction between them shift. Until then, it had been something she could dismiss. Curiosity, chemistry, a vacation flirtation that would disappear once they returned to normal life. Now, it felt dangerous, because Lorenzo wasn't flirting, he was choosing. And Amelia knew enough about men like Lorenzo De Luca to understand that being chosen by one could change the shape of your life. She told him she didn't know what he expected from her. Lorenzo stepped slightly closer, not enough to invade her space, enough to make his intention unmistakable. Nothing you don't choose. 5 words. Then he stepped back. Amelia watched him leave. For several seconds. She couldn't move, because that had affected her more than any expensive gesture could have. Lorenzo hadn't demanded an answer, hadn't asked her to prove she was interested, hadn't behaved as though his attention was some prize she should immediately accept. He had simply told her the truth, and left the decision with her. For the first time, Amelia wondered whether she had judged him too quickly. That evening changed everything. The resort hosted a private cocktail gathering near the water. Amelia considered skipping it. She went anyway. Lorenzo arrived late. His white shirt and dark trousers made him look deceptively relaxed, but Amelia immediately noticed the difference in him. His bodyguards were closer tonight. One remained behind him. The other continually scanned the gathering. Lorenzo wasn't drinking, and every few minutes, his gaze moved toward the resort entrance. He was waiting for someone. Amelia knew it. She didn't know who. At 8:17, a black SUV stopped outside. A man stepped out, tall, expensively dressed, gray beginning at his temples. The moment Lorenzo saw him, every trace of warmth disappeared from his face. Amelia had seen Lorenzo cold before. This was different. This was the man Chicago whispered about. The man beneath the tailored shirts and quiet conversations. The man who commanded armed men with one lifted hand. Marco Vescari crossed the terrace. He greeted Lorenzo like an old friend. Lorenzo received him like a man examining a loaded weapon. Nobody else seemed to notice. Amelia did. Minutes later, Lorenzo and Marco disappeared through a side entrance. Amelia tried to return her attention to Claire, then Vanessa, then the gathering. But something felt wrong. 20 minutes passed. One of Lorenzo's bodyguards moved quickly across the terrace. Not running. Men like him didn't need to run to communicate urgency. Amelia watched him disappear through the same entrance. Then she heard something. Not a gunshot, not shouting. A crash. Muted. Distant. From somewhere inside the private wing. Several guests looked toward the building. Music continued. A resort employee quickly closed one of the doors. Amelia's stomach tightened. She should have remained where she was. She knew that. Instead, several minutes later, she went inside looking for the restroom. At least, that was what she told herself. The corridor was nearly empty. She followed the signs. Then voices reached her from around the corner. One belonged to Lorenzo. Amelia stopped. His voice was low. Controlled, terrifyingly controlled. She couldn't hear every word, but she heard enough. Money, accounts, Chicago, a shipment that had been redirected without authorization. Then another voice. Marco, defensive, angry. Lorenzo spoke again. This time Amelia heard the sentence clearly. You stole from me. then came into my resort believing I wouldn't know. Amelia's blood went cold. My resort. She hadn't known. Marco said something too quiet to understand. Then Lorenzo answered, "You have until midnight to tell me who helped you." Silence. "And if I don't?" Lorenzo's response was quieter. Amelia didn't hear it. She didn't need to, because Marco's face appeared around the corner seconds later, and whatever Lorenzo had said had drained the color from it. Amelia moved backward. Too late. Marco saw her. Their eyes met. 1 second, maybe less, but it was enough. Amelia turned immediately and walked toward the main corridor. Behind her, silence. Then Lorenzo appeared. He saw Amelia, saw Marco looking after her, and everything changed. Lorenzo crossed the distance quickly. He didn't touch Amelia, but his body positioned itself instinctively between her and Marco. His eyes went to hers. "How much did you hear?" Amelia could have lied. She didn't. Enough. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. Behind him, Marco was being escorted away by one of the bodyguards. Amelia watched. Then looked back at Lorenzo. The charming mystery was gone now. So was the possibility of pretending the rumors about him were exaggerated. This was Lorenzo De Luca. The real Lorenzo De Luca. Power. Secrets. Men who became pale when he spoke quietly. And danger hiding underneath expensive surroundings. Amelia's heartbeat accelerated, but she didn't run. She asked the only question that mattered. "Am I in danger because I know you?" For the first time since Amelia had met him, Lorenzo didn't have an immediate answer. His eyes moved toward the corridor, where Marco had disappeared, then toward his bodyguards. Then back to Amelia. Something dark settled over his face. Because Marco Vescari had just seen the one woman Lorenzo De Luca had followed. The one woman he'd openly singled out. The one woman everyone at the resort had already noticed him watching. And in Lorenzo's world, attention could become information. Information could become leverage. Leverage could become a weapon. Lorenzo finally looked Amelia directly in the eyes. Yes, one word. No comforting lie. No false promise. Just the truth. Amelia went completely still. Lorenzo lowered his voice. "But nobody is going to touch you." He turned toward his men. And the next command changed Amelia's vacation completely. "Lock the property down." One guard immediately reached for his phone. The other moved toward Amelia. Lorenzo stopped him with a look. Then Lorenzo looked back at the woman who had walked away from him because she refused to compete for his attention. Only 3 days later, she had become the one person on the entire property he could no longer afford to lose sight of. And somewhere inside that beautiful resort, a traitor had just discovered exactly where Lorenzo De Luca's attention belonged. The resort changed within minutes. Most guests never understood why. Music continued near the water. Dinner service continued. Champagne still moved between tables. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. But Amelia noticed everything. Doors that had been open were suddenly guarded. 2 unfamiliar men appeared near the main entrance. Vehicles were checked before leaving. Staff members received quiet instructions through earpieces, and Lorenzo De Luca was no longer pretending to be merely another wealthy guest. He stood at the end of the corridor, speaking quietly to one of his men. No raised voice, no panic, just commands. Short, precise, immediate. People moved the moment he finished speaking. Amelia watched from several feet away. This was the part of Lorenzo's world she hadn't seen. The part newspapers couldn't print without evidence. The part polite society whispered about behind closed doors. And somehow, she was standing directly inside it. Lorenzo finished speaking and came toward her. His expression changed slightly when his eyes reached hers. Not softer exactly, more controlled, as though he was deliberately preventing whatever was happening around them from touching her. He explained only what she needed to know. Marco Vescari wasn't acting alone. Money had been moved through accounts connected to the resort. Someone inside Lorenzo's organization had helped him. And until Lorenzo knew who, Amelia couldn't leave the property unprotected. Amelia immediately objected. Not loudly, but firmly. She hadn't agreed to become a prisoner because Lorenzo had enemies. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. She could see the instinct inside him. The instinct to command. He was accustomed to giving instructions and watching them become reality. Amelia Carter was not one of his soldiers. And she made certain he understood it. Lorenzo stared at her for several seconds. Then he did something his men rarely witnessed. He adjusted. Amelia could move around the resort. She could stay with her friends. She could decide where she went. But two of Lorenzo's men would remain close. Not because Lorenzo wanted control, because Marco had seen her. That changed everything. Amelia didn't like it, but she understood it. For now. When she returned to the suite she shared with her friends, the questions began immediately. Claire wanted to know why security had suddenly doubled. Bianca had heard rumors that an important guest had attempted to steal from the resort. Vanessa remained strangely quiet. Amelia told them there had been a security problem, and Lorenzo believed they should remain on the property until it was resolved. She didn't mention the money. She didn't mention Marco. And she definitely didn't mention Lorenzo, admitting that knowing him might have placed her in danger. But Vanessa noticed the two men positioned outside. Her eyes moved from them to Amelia, and something uncomfortable passed across her face. This wasn't flirtation anymore. Whatever was happening between Amelia and Lorenzo had crossed into something none of them had expected. Amelia went to bed late. Sleep didn't come. Every unfamiliar sound seemed louder. Every footstep in the corridor made her eyes open. Sometime after midnight, she heard voices outside. Then silence. Then a knock. Amelia sat upright. Another knock followed. Controlled. 3 taps. She crossed the room carefully. One of Lorenzo's men stood outside. "Mr. De Luca needs to speak with you." Amelia's stomach tightened. Minutes later, she entered a private sitting room downstairs. Lorenzo was standing near the window. His sleeves were rolled up. His jacket was gone. There was a small cut across one knuckle. Amelia noticed it immediately. She didn't ask. Lorenzo turned. Marco Viscari had disappeared. Not escaped from the resort. Disappeared from the room where Lorenzo's men had been holding him. One guard had been found unconscious. A service exit had been opened using an employee access card, which meant the betrayal went deeper than Lorenzo had believed. Someone inside the resort was helping Marco, someone close enough to know where he was being held, and whoever that person was, had watched Lorenzo spend the last several days following Amelia Carter with his eyes. Lorenzo didn't need to explain the rest. Amelia understood. Her face changed. Lorenzo saw it. Fear. Not hysteria. Not panic. Realistic fear. The kind intelligent people felt when they finally understood the shape of a threat. Lorenzo stepped closer. He told her she would be moved to the private De Luca villa on the northern side of the property. Amelia immediately refused. Lorenzo's expression hardened. This time, he didn't adjust as quickly. Because this wasn't about inconvenience anymore. Marco was loose. A traitor was helping him. And Lorenzo had spent several days making one fact painfully obvious to anyone paying attention. Amelia mattered. That made her useful. Amelia hated the implication. She hated even more that Lorenzo was right. But she refused to leave her friends exposed while she disappeared behind armed guards. Lorenzo had already considered that. Claire, Bianca, and Vanessa would be moved too. Additional security would cover the villa. Nobody would be left behind. That stopped Amelia. Lorenzo had thought about her friends, even Vanessa. Not because he cared whether Vanessa liked him. Because Amelia cared about Vanessa. The distinction wasn't lost on her. An hour later, 4 women who had arrived expecting a luxurious vacation were being escorted across a moonlit resort by armed men. No one joked. No one competed for Lorenzo's attention. No one cared who he had looked at first. The game they thought they had been playing was gone. This was real. As Amelia entered the private villa, she turned. Lorenzo remained outside, speaking to his men, preparing to leave. "Where are you going?" He looked at her. "To finish this." That was all. Then Lorenzo De Luca disappeared into the darkness. And Amelia realized something she wasn't ready to admit. She wasn't afraid only because Lorenzo had enemies. She was afraid because Lorenzo was walking toward them. The next morning, Lorenzo had not returned. Amelia woke after barely 2 hours of sleep. His men wouldn't tell her where he was. Every answer was respectful. Every answer revealed nothing. By noon, irritation had replaced fear. By afternoon, fear returned. Then Amelia saw the black vehicles approaching. She stood before she realized she was doing it. The first SUV stopped. 2 men stepped out. Then Lorenzo, alive, uninjured, cold. Amelia released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Lorenzo looked toward the villa. Their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them that neither could pretend was casual anymore. Amelia had worried about him. Lorenzo knew. But before either could speak, one of his men approached rapidly and handed Lorenzo a phone. Lorenzo listened. His face changed. He looked directly toward Amelia, then toward the villa. His voice dropped. "Get them inside!" Amelia's stomach fell, because Marco Vescari had finally made contact, and his message contained only 7 words. "I know what the woman means to you." By evening, Amelia wanted to leave. Not the villa, the entire resort. The situation had become something she could no longer pretend was temporary inconvenience. She had come for a vacation. Now, armed men stood outside her door. Her friends were frightened. Marco knew who she was, and Lorenzo's world had begun closing around her before she'd even decided whether she wanted a place inside it. Lorenzo disagreed. Leaving now would make Amelia easier to reach. The resort was controlled territory. Outside it, there were too many roads, too many vehicles, too many possibilities. Amelia understood the logic. She still hated it. Their disagreement remained quiet at first. Then Lorenzo told one of his men that Amelia wasn't to leave the villa without an escort. That was the moment everything changed. Amelia looked at him. Lorenzo recognized the expression immediately. He had crossed a line. She told him that protection did not give him ownership. Lorenzo said he knew. Amelia wasn't convinced, because Lorenzo's entire life had taught him to solve danger through control. Control the exits, control the information, control the people, control every possible variable until nothing could surprise him. But Amelia was not a variable. She was a person. And if Lorenzo couldn't understand the difference, there was nothing between them worth exploring. The words landed harder than Amelia intended. Lorenzo became completely still. He didn't argue. That somehow made it worse. Amelia walked away. Again. But this time, there was no curiosity in Lorenzo's expression. There was something far more dangerous. Regret. Later that afternoon, Vanessa found Amelia alone. The tension between them had become impossible to ignore. Vanessa finally admitted that she had been jealous, not because Amelia had stolen Lorenzo. She hadn't. That was precisely what had bothered Vanessa. Amelia hadn't tried. Vanessa had. She had adjusted her posture when Lorenzo appeared, found reasons to approach, made herself available, and Lorenzo had looked past all of it, toward the woman walking away. It had made Vanessa feel foolish. Worse, it had made her feel invisible. Amelia's anger softened. She understood insecurity. What she wouldn't accept was being punished for someone else's. There had never needed to be a competition. Vanessa had created one because she'd assumed Lorenzo's attention was something a woman had to win. Amelia never believed that. Their reconciliation wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for now, that was enough. Then Vanessa said something Amelia wasn't expecting. "Don't walk away from him because of me." Amelia looked at her. Vanessa continued quietly. If you walk away, do it because you want to. The words remained with Amelia long after Vanessa left. Unfortunately, someone else had already made a decision for her. At 6:40 that evening, one of the resort's security vehicles arrived to take Claire and Bianca to the main building after management announced that the security threat had been contained. Everything looked legitimate. The driver wore resort identification. Security had supposedly approved the transfer. Vanessa decided to remain behind. Amelia almost did too. Then Claire realized she'd left her phone charger in their original suite. Amelia offered to go with them. The vehicle left. It traveled less than half a mile before Amelia knew something was wrong. The road toward the main building was to the left. The driver turned right. Amelia sat forward. Claire noticed. Bianca stopped talking. Amelia asked where they were going. No answer. The locks clicked. A tiny sound. Almost harmless, but every woman in that vehicle understood what it meant. Amelia's blood went cold. The security problem had not been contained. They were inside it. The vehicle accelerated. Amelia didn't scream. She looked around. Windows, doors, driver, distance, possibilities. Then she saw another black vehicle approaching behind them at terrifying speed. The driver looked into his mirror. For the first time, he appeared nervous. Amelia turned. The SUV behind them came closer and closer. Then she recognized the man sitting in the passenger seat, one of Lorenzo's bodyguards. The vehicle carrying Amelia swerved. Claire screamed. Bianca grabbed the seat. The driver tried to turn onto a narrow service road. He never made it. Another DeLuca vehicle blocked the entrance. Brakes screamed. The security vehicle stopped violently. Doors opened. Men moved. Fast. Controlled. Amelia pulled Claire down. Everything outside became movement and shouted commands. Then the rear door opened. Amelia turned sharply. Lorenzo. His face was unlike anything she had seen before. Not cold, not controlled, furious. But the moment he saw Amelia, something inside him changed. His eyes moved over her quickly, face, arms, hands, checking, making certain. Amelia was safe. Claire was safe. Bianca was safe. The driver was dragged from the vehicle. Another man was pulled from the front passenger seat. Lorenzo didn't look at them. Not yet. His attention remained on Amelia. She stepped out. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then, Amelia realized something. Lorenzo had come himself. Not sent men. Not waited somewhere secure for an update. He had chased the vehicle. The man who never chased anyone had come after her. Lorenzo's hand lifted, as though he intended to touch her face. He stopped before making contact. Amelia saw the hesitation. She closed the remaining distance herself. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist. Just briefly. Permission. Lorenzo touched her cheek. 1 second. That was all. Then the coldness returned, because there were still enemies around them. And Lorenzo DeLuca wasn't finished. The driver broke quickly. Marco had bribed a resort security supervisor months earlier. The missing money had partly funded the arrangement. The plan hadn't been to kill Amelia. That would have been stupid. Marco wanted leverage. Something valuable enough to force Lorenzo into a meeting on territory he didn't control. But Marco had made one catastrophic mistake. He assumed Amelia was merely Lorenzo's weakness. He hadn't understood that she was also the reason Lorenzo would become more dangerous. By midnight, Lorenzo knew where Marco was, an unfinished lakefront property several miles away. His men prepared to move. Amelia watched from the villa entrance. This time, she didn't ask Lorenzo where he was going. She knew. Lorenzo looked at her before entering the SUV. There were things neither of them could say yet. Things that had become too large for a resort romance. Then he left. Marco Vescari had spent years working beside Lorenzo. He knew Lorenzo's methods, his businesses, his organization, his habits. What Marco didn't know was the man Lorenzo had become the moment Amelia Carter entered his life. By sunrise, Marco's network inside the DeLuca organization had collapsed. Accounts were frozen. The corrupt security supervisor was in custody. Every man who had helped move the money had been identified, and Marco Viscari would never again threaten Amelia Carter. Lorenzo returned shortly after dawn. No celebration. No dramatic announcement. Just a tired man walking into a quiet villa after eliminating the threat hanging over everyone inside it. Amelia was waiting. Lorenzo stopped when he saw her. He told her it was over. Amelia believed him. Then Lorenzo did something she hadn't expected. He ordered the guards away from her door. All of them. Her movements were hers again. If she wanted to leave that morning, she could. If she wanted to stay, she could. And if she wanted to walk away from Lorenzo DeLuca permanently, he wouldn't stop her. Amelia stared at him. Days earlier, he had been the man everyone approached. Then he became the man who followed her. Now, when he finally had every reason to hold tighter, he opened his hand and gave her a choice. The resort slowly returned to normal. Guests who knew nothing about what had happened complained about delayed services. Music returned to the beach. Staff reopened the restricted areas. Tables appeared near the water again. From the outside, the beautiful little world repaired itself quickly. But Amelia had changed. So had Lorenzo. The following morning, Amelia stood near the shoreline where everything had started. No guards beside her. No restrictions. No danger. Just water moving against the sand and the freedom to leave. Her bags were packed. Claire and Bianca wanted to return to Chicago that afternoon. Vanessa had agreed. Their vacation was effectively over. Amelia should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt unfinished. Footsteps approached behind her. She knew who it was. Lorenzo stopped several feet away. He didn't come closer, not until she turned. Amelia looked at him. For once, Lorenzo seemed prepared for an answer he might not like. That mattered. Amelia told him she couldn't become another possession inside his world. She couldn't live surrounded by women, waiting to see whether Lorenzo might notice them. She wouldn't tolerate being deliberately made jealous. She wouldn't abandon her career, her friends, her independence, and she would never compete for the privilege of being loved by him. Lorenzo listened. No interruption. No argument. When Amelia finished, he understood something clearly. She thought she was describing conditions. To Lorenzo, she was describing the exact woman he wanted. He had never been attracted to Amelia because she could fit neatly inside his life. He was attracted to her because because she challenged its assumptions simply by existing inside it as herself. Lorenzo stepped closer. He didn't promise to become harmless. That would have been a lie. He didn't promise his world would suddenly become simple. That would have been an even bigger one. He promised something more difficult. Choice. Amelia would always have one. He would protect her, but he would learn not to cage her. He would listen, even when every instinct inside him told him to command. And there would be no other women waiting in the wings. Not because Amelia demanded that Lorenzo stop being desired. That was impossible. But because being desired and encouraging it were two completely different things. Lorenzo finally understood why Amelia had walked away that first afternoon. She hadn't wanted him to chase her. She had wanted no part in the contest. And somewhere between that shoreline, the dinner, the quiet conversations, the betrayal, and the moment Lorenzo saw her trapped inside that vehicle, the contest had ceased to exist. There was only Amelia. Vanessa apologized properly before they left. No excuses. No blaming Lorenzo. No pretending jealousy hadn't happened. She admitted something she'd never liked admitting even to herself. For years, Vanessa had measured desirability through competition. If other women wanted a man, winning his attention felt more valuable. Then Amelia had done the opposite. She had seen 3 women surrounding one of Chicago's most desirable men, and decided her peace was worth more. Watching Lorenzo become fascinated by Adunes. That had forced Vanessa to reconsider more than one thing about herself. Amelia forgave her, not because the words hadn't hurt, because friendship mattered more than pride, when both people were willing to tell the truth. By afternoon, the women were ready to leave. Lorenzo didn't ask Amelia to stay. That surprised everyone, especially Amelia. A vehicle waited near the resort entrance. Her friends loaded their luggage. Amelia stood beside the open door. Across the courtyard, Lorenzo watched. His two bodyguards stood several feet behind him. The scene felt almost identical to the first afternoon. Lorenzo surrounded by power, Amelia preparing to move away from it. She looked at him. Lorenzo didn't move. He had told her the choice was hers. He meant it. Amelia entered the vehicle. The door closed. For several seconds, Lorenzo simply stood there. Then the vehicle began moving. One of his bodyguards glanced toward him. Lorenzo's expression remained unreadable. The SUV reached the resort gates. Then, it stopped. The rear door opened. Amelia stepped out. Lorenzo's bodyguard looked at his boss. Lorenzo didn't breathe. Amelia spoke briefly to the driver. The vehicle continued without her. Then she turned and started walking back, toward Lorenzo. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Lorenzo De Luca didn't know exactly what was about to happen. Amelia stopped in front of him. She told him she wasn't staying permanently. She still had a life in Chicago. Work waiting. Responsibilities. And Lorenzo had a great deal to prove. But she wasn't ready for whatever existed between them to end at the resort gates. Something almost dangerously close to relief entered Lorenzo's eyes. Amelia saw it and smiled. This wasn't surrender. It wasn't happily ever after. Not yet. It was a beginning, and beginnings required choices. This time, Amelia was choosing him. 3 months later, Lorenzo De Luca entered a private charity event in downtown Chicago. The reaction was familiar. Heads turned. Conversations shifted. Women noticed. Men became careful. Lorenzo had lived with that reaction for years. It meant almost nothing anymore. Amelia arrived separately after work. She wore a deep burgundy dress, not because of the resort, because she liked the color. Across the room, a beautiful woman had already approached Lorenzo. Then another. Amelia saw them. Vanessa, standing beside her, noticed too. For 1 second, Vanessa looked toward Amelia, as though waiting for the old story to repeat itself. Amelia simply continued her conversation. No competition, no performance, no sudden need to prove that Lorenzo belonged to her. She didn't move toward him. She didn't have to. Across the room, Lorenzo saw Amelia. Everything else disappeared. The woman speaking to him was still mid-sentence when Lorenzo politely excused himself. Then, Chicago's coldest mafia boss crossed the crowded ballroom. Past businessmen who wanted meetings. Past women who wanted introductions. Past people who would have waited hours for 5 minutes of his attention. Straight toward Amelia Carter. Vanessa saw him coming. Her smile grew. Amelia turned only when Lorenzo reached her. His hand settled gently at her waist. There was something almost amusing about it now. Months earlier, women had crossed rooms to reach Lorenzo De Luca. Tonight, Lorenzo had crossed one for Amelia, and everyone noticed. Later that evening, they stood alone on a balcony overlooking Chicago. The city stretched beneath them. Lorenzo told Amelia something he had never admitted. When she'd walked away from him on that beach, his first reaction hadn't been attraction, it had been confusion. Everyone came toward Lorenzo eventually. Employees, enemies, politicians, businessmen, women. Everyone wanted something. Amelia had looked at everything people associated with Lorenzo De Luca. Wealth, power, beauty, danger, and decided none of it was worth competing for. She had chosen herself. That was what made him look twice. Amelia smiled. You thought I was trying to make you chase me. At first. And then? Lorenzo looked at her. Then I realized you genuinely didn't care." Amelia laughed softly. Lorenzo's expression changed. Warmer now, something only a handful of people would ever see. Amelia stepped away from the balcony railing and began walking toward the ballroom. Lorenzo followed. She noticed. Of course she did. Amelia glanced over her shoulder. "Are you following me, DeLuca?" "Yes." Her eyebrow lifted. "I thought you didn't chase women." Lorenzo stopped directly in front of her. His answer came without hesitation. "I don't." A pause. His eyes remained on hers. "I chase one." Amelia stared at him for a second, then smiled. And this time, she didn't walk away. Because Amelia Carter had never needed to compete for Lorenzo DeLuca. She had never needed to become louder, smaller, more glamorous, more agreeable, or more desperate to be chosen. She had simply remained herself. And somehow, that had become the one thing Chicago's coldest mafia boss couldn't walk away from. If Lorenzo and Amelia's story kept you watching until the very end, show some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to Mafia Muse Affairs for more powerful mafia romance stories filled with danger, passion, and unexpected love. And before you go, drop your country or city in the comments. I'd love to see where everyone is watching from.